UNESCO World Heritage. It is our firm belief that Hong Kong is not far behind. With its unique tapestry of sites ranging from organically evolved coastal villages, intentionally designed gardens and parks, or associative traditional settlements and landforms, Hong Kong possesses a diverse range of cultural landscapes that deserves recognition, without which we cannot begin to discuss how to conserve these cultural heritage assets. Unfortunately, due to lack of understanding, pressures from development, insufficient management regime mechanisms, a number of Hong Kong cultural landscapes have already disappeared, and with many others facing imminent danger. So to facilitate better understanding of our cultural landscapes and to initiate a dialogue on formalizing recognition of cultural landscapes as heritage assets, which can enrich and benefit our city qualitatively and quantitatively, HK Icon has been promoting a series of CPD events under the title Understanding Cultural Landscapes. With the support of a number of well-regarded local and overseas scholars and practitioners, the series comprised of site visits to examples of local cultural landscapes, some of which you may have already attended, and culminating in today's symposium. So as a recap, some of the previous events in our series includes site tours to the Fanling Golf Course. And also previously on the 13th of October, we had a lecture by Dr. Ken Nicholson, who is also here with us today, talk about cultural landscapes. And of course, there are also two upcoming events, the tour to Chak Wolang, and also the tour to Tai Seng Wai. We're not a large professional organization. And this is really the first symposium of its kind, which we have organized. So we sincerely hope that the CPD series will not only highlight the significance of cultural landscapes as heritage assets, but also the fact that it can potentially provide new opportunities to sustainably utilize our heritage assets when we formulate a cultural tourism policy in the near future. But more importantly, we hope to demonstrate the fragility of these sites, threats and challenges, and drawing on expert opinions to present some lessons, which we can all learn to achieve a truly sustainable management of Hong Kong's cultural landscapes. So let me begin by introducing some of our speakers today who are with us at Tai Kwun. So Mr. Ben Lo, please stand up. So I think most of us here know Ben Lo. He is the Chief Assistant Secretary of the Commissioner of Heritage's Office at the Development Bureau. So he graduated from the University of Hong Kong in civil engineering in 1990. He obtained a master's degree of science in architectural conservation at the University of Hong Kong in 2010. He is a chartered civil engineer and an architectural conservationist. And Ben joined the Hong Kong government in 1990 upon graduation and worked previously in the Highways Department, Water Supplies Department, and he was responsible for overseeing a lot of construction projects and design offices. And he joined CHO in 2020, overseeing a large number of revitalization projects and historic buildings in Hong Kong. And also this building, which we are now in. And of course, the second speaker is David Morkel. So David, would you please stand up? So David is a professional landscape architect and town planner and the director of landscape planning consultancy Urbis Limited. He has over 28 years of professional experience working in the UK, Hong Kong, Middle East, and China. And over that time, David has developed a particular interest in and gained experience of the assessment and management of historic and cultural landscapes in both UK and Hong Kong. And finally, here at Tai Kwun, we have Ken Nicholson. So Ken. So Ken is no stranger to most of you. He's an architectural conservationist and landscape architect and urban planner in Hong Kong. and he's practiced for almost 40 years. And he's taught in HKU's Division of Architectural Conservation program for 20 years. And is credited with introducing the concept of cultural landscape to Hong Kong. Now, his 3 books on the topic, The Happy Valley, Landscapes Lost and Found, and Water Driven, are considered essential readings for local scholars and students of cultural landscape. And throughout his academic and professional career, he has won many awards, including the 26 UNESCO Asia Pacific Awards for Cultural Heritage Conservation. And joining us from overseas, we have Mr. Lawrence Lowe. Hi, Lawrence. Okay. So Lawrence is an architect by profession. And of course, he's no stranger to the Hong Kong Heritage Conservation community. He's an honorary fellow of HK Icon and has been active support of Hong Kong's conservation endeavors for over 25 years. To acknowledge his teaching contributions as an annual lecturer in the ACP Heritage Management course and expertise in in-depth knowledge he continues to share at HKU has honored him with the adjunct professorship. And he is active from time to time as an advisor to the Urban Renewal Authority, the Antiquities and Monuments Board, and other interest groups in Hong Kong. And further afield, he is presenting, collaborating with the Getty Conservation Institute on an urban conservation planning course for ASEAN countries. And this is in conjunction with UNESCO, so as to develop and deepen its outreach through new programs and its UNESCO Asia Pacific Cultural Heritage Awards and the World Heritage Center through ICOMOS on site evaluation technical reviews. And of course, we have Michael Morrison. So Michael. Okay. So again, Michael is no stranger to Hong Kong. And in fact, the fruits of his labor is right here in Tai Kwun. So he's a conservation architect and previously the managing partner and chairman of the Architects Purcell, now semi-retired after 50 years in the business and acting as a consultant to the firm. Michael has been on the Architects Advisory Panel for the National Trust, a member of expert panels advising Heritage Lottery Fund, and the Commissioner for Historic England. So over the years, he has been responsible for the repair, adaptation, and conservation of some of England's most significant historic buildings, which have been set in highly significant design landscapes. Michael opened Purcell's office in Hong Kong in 1929 and was responsible for Project Tai Kwun in Hong Kong. And finally, last but not least, we have Montera. Hi, Montera. Okay, so Montera is a cultural program officer at UNESCO Bangkok. She has managed various UNESCO programs within the Asia Pacific region and related to the safeguarding and sustainable development of cultural heritage, with a focus on World Heritage. She has developed capacity building programs such as reviving traditional knowledge of conserving built heritage, sustainable heritage tourism, and collections management. She has a bachelor's degree in economics and East Asian studies from Harvard University, MCP and MArch from the University of California, Berkeley, in the architecture and in city planning, and a PhD in urban planning and Chulalongkorn University. So we have actually assembled a very diverse and very knowledgeable panel of speakers today. And so to begin, we're going to have Ken Nicholson, who's going to introduce us to the concept of cultural landscapes. Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, now David is going to talk to us about how to go about it. So the need for a historic and cultural landscape classification scheme. So now I'm going to pass over to you, David. So David, please. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here to talk to you today about what I perceive to be an omission, a missing piece in the system of land use planning and management in Hong Kong with regard to cultural landscapes, and to talk a little bit about a tool that has been used elsewhere for addressing this. As an erratum, I should point out the title of my talk is about historic landscape characterization. It's advertised as classification. The two issues are very closely aligned, as I will explain. My interest in cultural landscapes is as a landscape designer and also as a town planner. I'm not a conservationist. That's not my skill, my specialism. My interest is in the appropriate management and planning of land, and that includes cultural landscapes. My background in this area, when I started practice in the UK, I was involved in the historic landscape assessment of a number of notable historic landscapes, including one by Capability Brown and one by Humphrey Repton, quite famous landscape architects, and also then proposing management plans for those landscapes. Another area of interest and specialism is in the field of landscape characterization, landscape mapping. This is something that I worked on in the UK, and I was part of the team in Hong Kong that produced Hong Kong's first landscape character map. I'll talk to you more about what exactly that means. So in summary, I'm going to say a little bit about landscapes and cultural landscapes, although Ken has done a much better job than I can do. Talk about cultural landscapes in the Hong Kong planning system, landscape characterization and classification, what is that? Then specifically about historic landscape characterization and what opportunities and challenges we have in Hong Kong for the recognition of cultural landscapes in our planning and land use management system. Landscape, very briefly, is effectively part of the land that it's perceived and viewed by human beings as fundamental to making it a landscape, otherwise it's just land. And it evolves through time as the result of the interaction of natural forces and human beings, as Ken has pointed out. This is the Florence Convention, which is the EU Landscape Convention. The components of landscape are both natural and man-made. We look at geology and topography, vegetation, hydrological features, human settlement, transportation, infrastructure, extractive industries, mining, agriculture, military infrastructure, designed landscapes, and also, very importantly, cultural and spiritual components. Ken has already mentioned that Carl Sauer was the first geographer to identify cultural landscapes, and the important thing here is that it's the interaction of the natural environment fashioned by man that results in cultural landscapes. And also importantly, there's a temporal dimension. They evolve over time, and they never stop. UNESCO has recognized the importance of cultural landscapes in a similar way. And importantly, they call them part of our collective identity all over the world. So what I would like to suggest is that every landscape that has been colonized by humans, so we can exclude wilderness here. There are very few of those probably in the world that have not been affected by man, at least by climate change. But cultural landscapes are urban, rural, they're vernacular, they're designed, they're ancient, they're modern, and because they're expressions of the interaction that human beings have with their environment over time. This temporal component, I think, is fundamental to understanding cultural landscapes, that they have historic components, although that history may be a modern history. Now, the issue of cultural landscapes came to the forefront of discussion recently in Hong Kong during the scrutiny, the public scrutiny of the feasibility study and the environmental impact assessment for a proposed development on part of Fan Leng Golf Course, which is in the Northern New Territories. Fan Leng Golf Course is a design landscape over 100 years old. It contains a number of features of cultural heritage interest. These are generally built buildings or graves, and many of these are recognized. It also contains a number of natural features of significance, some very old and valuable trees. and some important habitat. So while the environmental impact assessment recognized the value of these features individually, commentators questioned whether it recognized the value, the combined value, the holistic value of all these features together. That is their value as a landscape. And a landscape which has been designed and managed over time to look a certain way. So the question is, to what extent is our planning system, our environmental impact assessment system, recognizing area-based cultural assets rather than individual components, individual trees, individual buildings? As Ken has pointed out, we have mechanisms in place for this. In Hong Kong, there's a number of instruments to recognize and, in one case only, protect the cultural heritage assets. The Antiquities and Monuments Ordinance is the only one that affords robust protection. The others are generally administrative. We have a cultural heritage impact assessment procedure under the EIAO. Conservationists talk about point line plane approaches to the assessment of cultural assets. And what I think is evident in Hong Kong is that our cultural assets are recognized almost exclusively as points-based assets. That is, not plane or planar assets, or not area-based assets. We have we have a system for recognizing cultural heritage assets, but as points rather than as landscapes. Contrast this with, as Ken has done, with the recognition of natural heritage assets in Hong Kong, and we have many recognition, designation, protection for those assets. Many of these are very extensive areas. So the obvious point here is that while natural heritage assets are recognized on an area basis, that our cultural heritage assets are recognized in a very different way. We don't have the same area view or recognition of them. And what I want to talk about is a tool that we can use to address this. This is called historic landscape characterization. And it's a tool that we can use to, first of all, survey, define, and understand our cultural assets on an area basis. I'll say a little bit about landscape characterization. In the UK, this started in the early 90s. I worked on a number of these studies. It was promoted by government across the country. Landscape character is defined by the Countryside Commission as a distinct and recognizable pattern of elements or characteristics in the landscape which make one landscape different from another. So what we are looking for is patterns of natural and built features represented in the landscape that give it its character or feeling, you might say. And then the way we recognize this is by an assessment, which is a classification and a mapping of areas of similar character found in different locations. So for example, you might have a settled valley landscape that occurs, it could occur anywhere across the area that you're studying. Upland landscapes occur in different places across different territories. What is landscape characterization useful for? It is a tool for planning appropriate development that's appropriate in that location. It can be used for restoration proposals, enhancement, landscape management, conservation, and preservation. It's not necessarily simply a conservation tool. I was part of the team that worked on Hong Kong's first landscape character map more than 15 years ago. And as you'll see, what we did is we defined different types of landscape based on their character. It's a little bit illegible, I regret. And then we classify, that's the classification component, and then we map them across Hong Kong. So you'll see that landscapes of a certain type occur across Hong Kong in different locations. And this covers both urban and rural. So historic landscape characterization is actually a subset of landscape characterization, but it looks at landscape in a slightly different way. The first one was done in Cornwall in the UK in 1994. And it begins from the premise that all landscape is historic. This is very important. So a historic landscape could be a 20th century landscape, could be a prehistoric landscape. Yeah, as I just said, it's important to recognize that modern landscapes are just as historic, just as important as prehistoric landscapes. The historic landscape characterization is the predominant historic landscape character that you see in the landscape. So what you're trying to identify is the era from which the components that you recognize in the landscape come. Now, those components could be from prehistory, but they're visible today. They could be from the 20th century. You're looking for the predominant features that date to that landscape. The sources you use for this are modern maps, very important because you're looking at the landscape of today, but you're looking for its history. Historical maps are equally important, and you look at time depth analysis, the layers of history that a landscape evolves through. Aerial photos are important too. Historic documents, these could be government records, they could be literature. Archaeological data. Archaeologists are usually key members of historic landscape characterization. And the method you use is to, as I said earlier, is you classify the landscape based on the period that it manifests today. You usually do this in a geographic information systems format, a GIS format, which can be used to compile, store data, interrogate it. You can also use it as part of the classification process, actually. So what a classification gives you is a series of polygons, as you can see on the screen, different historic landscape character types. Each polygon in the GIS will have a database with description components of it, its key attributes that give it its character and define it, any previous types, so that is its history it's gone through, key point-based data such as historic buildings, monuments. You can add to this spiritual components as well. And importantly, the sources of your assessments. Very important that it's transparent. This example is the historic landscapes map for Scotland. I was going to show you the one for England, but this is actually much more accessible to someone with very limited IT skills like myself. It's online. It's actually really fun to interrogate. So if you want to have a look, I would encourage you to do so. What you can see are what are called broad historic landscape character types. And these are then split into subtypes. So I'll show you some examples of two subtypes, agriculture and settlement and rural settlement. So as you can see, these are the subtypes from agriculture and settlement. And if you look at them, there are medieval ones, prehistoric ones, and modern ones. So we're not just looking at old stuff. We're looking at stuff of any age. But what you see in those images are components from that era that give the landscape its present day character. Similarly for rural settlement, again, you have medieval, you have industrial planned villages, they date from different eras throughout history. As I said, this is a screenshot from the database that you can use online. You can interrogate the database by period, by land use. You can click on individual polygons and it'll tell you about their landscape history. It's actually really fun. I would encourage you to have a go. Why is all of this important? I think it's well recognized that landscapes are part of our sense of place and local identity. They're part of our collective social memory, our living cultural and built heritage. They have artistic value, spiritual value, ethnographic value. We need to understand this if we are going to represent those landscapes and plan them, use them, and manage them appropriately within our planning and land use system. This is why this is important. However, we face challenges and opportunities in doing this. Anyone that spent any time in Hong Kong knows pretty well that our administrative system for land use and management favors development. Rights to the use and ownership of land are clearly prescribed in the basic law. This was the subject of a court case, a high-profile court case quite recently. We also face land supply issues, which I'm sure everyone knows about. Hong Kong has a housing problem, and the government is proactively looking for land to develop for housing. So recognition and particularly conservation and preservation of cultural landscapes will face challenges from the search for land. Land values, Hong Kong has some of the highest in the world. Anyone holding a cultural landscape will be interested in the potential development value, should they be able to develop that land. And you will inevitably find some landholders of cultural assets or any land who will not be particularly keen on seeing them preserved. They would rather develop them. And the key challenge is that we don't have a system, as Ken has pointed out, to recognize and then designate our area-based cultural assets. They're not represented in the system at the moment. So what are the opportunities? The first opportunity that a historic landscape characterization offers you is a chance to survey and document what we have. We can't have a discussion unless we know what there is. Ken's pointed out some excellent examples, but we need a comprehensive historic landscape characterization and assessment. It's an opportunity to start to discuss and talk about these landscapes. Until we know what we have, we can't really talk about them in a meaningful way. Historic landscape characterization prioritizes public participation and discussion to understand the values that landscapes hold. So we need to have this conversation in the public domain. That then gives us a chance to recognize these cultural assets in the planning process. Not all cultural assets and cultural landscapes deserve to be conserved or preserved. You need to take a fully balanced approach when looking at this. Ultimately, it's a tool to allow us to plan where development should go and how you should manage certain landscapes, whether we should conserve them, preserve them, develop them, enhance them. It's a wide-ranging tool. Another opportunity that I perceive is a change in government use of land resumption. It used to be have a very limited use, but recently government has suggested that they might start using it for natural heritage conservation, that is to acquire areas of land for natural heritage conservation. If they do that for natural heritage conservation, then why not for cultural landscapes? So that's a positive sign too. So in summary, what I'd like to suggest is I perceive an omission or a gap in the way that the planning and land use system in Hong Kong recognizes and or protects cultural landscapes. And I think what I've presented to you, I hope is a tool, a first step towards rectifying that omission. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So while now we have some insight into, in the context of Hong Kong, let's move overseas. And then let's talk about, let's say, how cultural landscapes are being appreciated in the overseas context. So let me introduce our next speaker. So Lawrence Lowe. Lawrence, are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you. Am I on the screen?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay.
So Lawrence, you're going to introduce us about cultural landscapes in Malaysia. Is that correct?
Directly and indirectly, yes. I'll be speaking of a few various things. Perhaps you can put it on. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to reconnect with Hong Kong Icon for the second time this year. I would actually love to be with you in person, but unfortunately, the conditions are not in my favor. But nonetheless, I'm so happy to be with you. My intention today is to briefly illustrate some of my personal insights into cultural landscapes. Not so much to talk about the technical aspects, and perhaps to discuss why the use of the concept could be offered as an attractive proposition when retention of mixed cultural sites in Hong Kong is being debated, as it is being done today. Right. Can I have next slide? Insights into cultural landscapes. This is an aerial photograph of Georgetown World Heritage Site, the city where I come from. The need for a historical or cultural landscape classification and what goes into an assessment framework, especially one with local Hong Kong characteristics, have already been articulated by the previous speakers. So it saves me from elaborating any further. As an activist and advocate in the very extensive field of cultural heritage conservation since the 1980s, as a lecturer in the Hong Kong U ACP course since its early days, and more importantly, as an avid Hong Kong observer, I concur that the cultural landscape classification fills a gap in your conservation milieu, and more importantly, represents a very critical and timely opportunity to be ahead of the curve. David has just mentioned the word gap. Where is that gap? and where does it sit? And why is it an opportunity in addition to what David has already recommended to you? Next. Or what David Mokel has termed the missing piece, right? The gap. Speaking from experience, especially of living and working in Penang, Malaysia, here I show you two maps, totally inaccurate because they were created a long time ago. Especially in Malaysia, Penang is a place that is special to me. And my immersion in activities, programs, and missions of UNESCO and the World Heritage Center, ICOMOS, ICROM, and lately, UN Habitat. There's already too much noise in the space for the general public and interest groups to handle. I could say this is equally applicable to Hong Kong. So how do you keep it simple? As I said preceding my presentation, the extent of this so-called noise relating to what the culture profession in terms of competency should know, and the framework that could be applied to identify a cultural landscape systematically has just been covered by today's experts. Let me go to where the gap is. It is for this very reason that it would be expedient to identify where the gap is and whether we can find a vision to fill that gap. Ken Nicholson has answered this question very efficiently and offered several recommendations. I will just try to add to this list. I put myself in the place of the person trying to sell the idea. So if I were the promoter of a particular heritage site and advocating its protection and management, I would have to suggest a conservation approach and framework that would do the job. One that appeals and makes sense to the audience I'm addressing. Would it be expedient for me to frame the value proposition as a cultural landscape as opposed to, say, a heritage site, a mere heritage site, a term that the lay public is more familiar with? Sometimes it's about how an idea is presented in a form that is not within the realm of common knowledge. Although the subject might be ordinary or common to everyone in general, for example, the subject of wind, which is illustrated in this slide, it's not generally so easy to convey an idea. But I use this slide to illustrate how I not necessarily try to be ahead of the curve, just to jump the curve a little. I created this original image to map the wind cycle and changing direction of the winds affecting Penang Island. The little turtle-shaped piece of land is Penang Island. A traditional fisherman shared this information with me. It shows how the directions of the winds shift 360 degrees clockwise annually. When I showed this to many architects, they hadn't seen this before. This slide suggests that traditional knowledge has an impact on both natural and cultural sites, which is rarely appreciated for its own value. More so in this case, because I couldn't find this chart anyway. You could call the climatic landscape the influencer, as in modern social media parlance, as opposed to the Michelin chef who's the creator of the food, which is the equivalent of the cultural landscape. I feel that in today's marketing plans, we need to get both into the mix to get the message through. Next. Looking at the combined works of nature and man, these are the definitions from the operational guidelines of the World Heritage Convention. And so I will not repeat them, right? They're out there for you to just remind yourself. But in the next slide, I will introduce more simple definitions. It's just to keep a variety of ideas in the mix. Let's look at the gap. Next. By default, every tourist visits a chosen location either for its culture, heritage, and history, or for its nature. This is what connects humanity to communities globally. And this is the baseline. This is the business side of heritage. They listen to the stories about the evolution of the place. They eat the food. They occupy the buildings and spaces and admire the architecture and the natural landscapes. But importantly, they take away unique memories and meanings. When they start to map the visual and mental images and synthesize the collective experience, doesn't it sound like they've just visited a cultural landscape where human beings and their physical interventions and the natural environment have coexisted over time? Be they historic design, historic vernacular, historic agricultural, or ethnographic landscapes as defined by the US National Park Service. Next. Globally, most of us are familiar with the first two, as they are urban sites, as opposed to the latter two, which involve natural sites. It's often been my experience that people I speak to do not understand how an agricultural or natural site could be a heritage site. They do not see where the significance is. This is the gap. And consequently, this is where the cultural landscape concept can be introduced to bridge the gap. The term in itself is very attractive and intriguing. If well presented, it could become a popular concept, given the culture, nature, conversations that are taking place today, or demonstrate universal heritage values like the salt pans, whether they are in Simplim Sai in Hong Kong or in Stone of Croatia. Right. Next. Equally, this is another ethnographic landscape, and it's just showing you hills and water, but it's actually the traditional century-old oyster farms in Stone of Croatia. Yeah. Next. Or we look at an agricultural landscape from Inle Lake in Myanmar. It's not just a joyride on the boat. These are actually floating gardens created to create agricultural plots on the lake because of lack of land in the natural and physical environment at the foothills of the hill. Again, would you call this a heritage site? Would you call this a cultural landscape? Many people visit it for its what do you call it? Its special interest features. Next. I find comparative analysis a useful tool to communicate ideas that resonate through association. In the case of these two examples of defensive walls built to keep enemies out, the juxtaposition of Eastern and European cultures sharing the same objectives would appeal to a Hong Kong audience, which is an invitation for me to introduce the next slide. Understanding cultural landscape. Can you advance the slide? Bring all the words in. As a counterbalance to the Eurocentric definitions of the term cultural landscapes that I shared earlier, I would like to introduce a term that's closer to home. The Chinese character yuan is composed of individual meanings, namely a building or pavilion, a pool or lake, a plant or rock, and an enclosure that symbolize the organization and components of a garden, which by definition is a landscape designed and created intentionally by people. Have I gone off the volume?
No, it's fine.
Fine. Huh? Okay.
Please continue.
Next. Moving on to English cultural landscapes. And I think David mentioned Humphrey Repton, whom I really enjoyed learning about. So let me introduce you to his designs. Importantly, to show that what was perceived as a natural landscape, as you look there, is in fact very contrived. A landscape designed and created intentionally by people as classified in operational guidelines. Go to the next slide. So which is the natural landscape? But it's artificially created, but look at the beauty of it. Look at the next slide. go to the next slide. Go to the third one. And let's see what he did with this vista. Change. Tap the animation. Can you advance it? Right. So all of these landscapes, which many of you who visit Great Britain admire the landscape and think that it's natural, in fact, it's man-made. But it's man-made for the appreciation of human beings. And if you knew the story of this, you would actually advocate its preservation, right? You would not agree to have high rises in the background, dominating the whole landscape, as unfortunately was for the Tiger Balm Garden in Hong Kong. Next. But my favorite cultural landscape is what I call the hidden cultural landscape, right? Which embodies the late Yi Fu Tuan's saying that, can you press the button? What begins as undifferentiated space becomes place when we get to know it better and endow it with value. Things are not always what they seem to be. This short narrative that I will indulge in will reveal the essence of what I call the hidden cultural landscape. And you'll see why it's impossible to classify it under any other category, like, for example, even the historic urban landscape of Hong Kong. On the left, you see an image of a tropical primary forest in Malaysia, totally undefined and just a mass of green to the urban land. However, to the Aborigine on the right, or we call them the Orang Asli, or original people, this is his home, his ancestral land. Right? Incidentally, the Australians have an official term to describe their Aborigines. We call them the First Nation. It's such a magnificent term for totally marginalized communities. And Malaysia is no better, right? We keep them marginalized. But go to the next slide. To the hidden eye, to the naked eye, to the native eye, that's attuned to his surroundings. The boundaries are obvious and as clear as day. You had to accompany them into the forest. And if you ask them to demarcate where their land is, they are able to tell you about it. They'll tell you, you walk straight to the big tree, you turn right and walk down to the river, you come back 2,000 paces, and you will see a big rock. And from that rock, you proceed onwards to other signposts. And they have a very clear idea of what their landscape is, what is within that landscape, and where it dominates, right? To them, there are many intangible signposts. For example, there are spirit shrines, there are burial grounds, and makeshift altars like this one I show in my slide. They build these makeshift altars and they put offerings on it, and it looks like a house, right? On the right-hand side, you actually see a ladder that brings you up to the platform, which represents the house. So this is just a makeshift altar. They cultivate fruit trees in the clearings, and they recognize all the natural landmarks, which are hidden, but always apparent through the man who owns the land, right? These intangible mental markers are embedded in collective memory, are verbally transmitted through storytelling and myths, customs, rituals, and events. And in fact, they may well have been marked with bloodshed in tribal wars. So this is what I call the hidden cultural landscape, right? Next. This is a full picture of the forest that I took my first slide from. Very, very dense. You cannot see anything. Next. But then what man has done in exactly the same forest, they have stripped it apart and created these tea plantations. Both photographs were taken from a helicopter as I flew over the landscape. And I think I call it the hidden landscape revealed. All of a sudden, as you move from one vegetation patch to another, you realize that one was natural and one was made by human people, right? Next. Again, another photograph of the tea plantation. Next. And very often when we forget, nature reclaims the landscape and takes it back from you. And perhaps if we just leave things alone, everything will go back to what it was originally intended for. Move to the next slide. Just as a brief intermission, just let me share this picture of an iceberg with you. It was created by a good friend of mine called Janet Delay, where she tried to show the relationship of tangible and intangible values, which goes, as you would imagine, into any landscape, right? What you see above the waterline are all the tangible cultural elements, whether it's about infrastructure, buildings, etc. But what you don't see is under the waterline, all the intangible cultural elements. And I always try and visualize this slide as a reminder of how I engage in my conservation work. Next. The opportunity, right? Recently, I find myself increasingly merging culture and nature in my workplace by virtue of the fact that I'm using the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals as a set of metrics or benchmarks. ICOMOS itself suggests that natural and cultural heritage are closely interconnected in most landscapes and seascapes, and that effective and lasting management and conservation of such heritage places depends on better integration of philosophies and procedures regarding their identification and management. Next. So how does this align with the SDGs, right? In 2015, ICOMOS actually created a policy called the integration of a sustainable development perspective into the process of the World Heritage Convention. And there's a policy coherence between the 1972 World Heritage Convention and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And this is actually the start of the opportunity to enrich your argument with any person that you're offering the idea to. Let me go to Penang and share a very quick case study. This is Georgetown World Heritage Site, painted in the 18th century. Next, a view from the hill today in 2008 when it was inscribed as a World Heritage Site. Next, a picture of the city itself. So I'm using this as a reference. Next. So learning from the Georgetown World Heritage experience, these are all the various things that we learned to appreciate and handle and apply to the World Heritage Site, right? Which, as you go through the list, you realize that it could also be used for any other site and landscape that you are trying to map. Next. From the sea and from the culture in the city, we proceed to nature in the hills in the far distance. Next. I love to show this because this is an early view painted from the sea, and most probably painted by an artist who never visited Penang, but who read a description of the Georgetown and which spoke about the great hill in the distance, and it looks nothing like in the photograph, right? And it was really in the pursuit of what we call romanticism of those days. Look at the next slide. Slightly more accurate, right? So after listing Georgetown, we started looking at the hills. Next. And what we did was we put together a dossier, and eventually we managed to get a great part of Penang Hill and other parts, including the ocean in the north, as part of the Penang Hill Biosphere Reserve under the UNESCO Man and Biosphere project. Next. The map on the left shows the extent of what the biosphere is. The light green, right, is the biosphere area together with the light blue line and the orange part around the northeastern side, which is actually a natural reserve. And then if you try and superimpose the World Heritage Site in the west on the Cape, you'll find that almost the whole of the northern part of Penang comes under some management system, right? So the opportunity starts with just maybe a conservation project, which then builds into World Heritage listing for cultural sites. And then with that under your belts, you go for much bigger and more ambitious possibilities, right? And this is what has happened in Penang. Next. So a view of the Biosphere Reserve. These are just to titillate your imagination. Next. When the mist comes in, right, you don't see it. Next. And then also the lovely animals that populate the whole hill, right? Lazy as it looks, this langua. Next. With few activities, this, on the left is a stupa valley where it's up an individual built golden stupas and is now a cultural landscape, or in habitat where we have this wonderful experience along the zip line through the Great Grand Forest. Next. So, but now with these in hand, the real work begins, namely the integration of an approach to heritage based on the understanding that relationships between people and the natural environment have worked to shape both our physical environments and belief systems, and that it embraces the complexity of our heritage, which includes biological resources, genes, landscapes, geological diversity, cultural expressions, places and practices, and traditional knowledge systems. And what this has done, it has spurred us on to actually start to look at climate change, right? So from all of this, the mandate now to push the program further becomes the objective of the whole community. So as an advocate pushing for sustainable development, my organization called Think City, in partnership with UN Habitat and the state government of Penang, are implementing a USD 10 million grant program on climate adaptation, which is our latest step by which the opportunity open to us. Okay. If you look at the chart, we are looking at built projects and strategies and actions, which are subdivided into urban greening, stormwater management, comprehensive vulnerability baseline assessments, social resilience, and institutional capacity. Next. So we have created this thing called the Penang-based Climate Adaptation Program. Here we look at focus areas. So again, if you amalgamate these two focus areas into the previous map I showed you, there's more and more things happening in the whole island itself. Next. Here is an urban greening proposal. It's a bit too small, but it's a series of programs for the Georgetown World Heritage Site. Next. Then there is stormwater management to stop flooding and to anticipate what will happen as the sea level rises. Next. And this is just the program that is in place today for the component. It's a bit small, but suffice to say that we are focused on, for example, on women and girls programs. We are looking at knowledge transfer platforms. We are looking at creating a Penang Climate Board, and we have many public health institutional programs. And all of this has just kickstarted this year. Next. So to conclude, by recognizing the gap where the idea of a cultural landscape can be skillfully introduced and then leveraging upon it to embrace a series of larger heritage and sustainability agendas, as I have explained to you, as in the case of Penang. I believe that you may be better placed to win hearts and minds in your quest for enlightenment. And I always use this as the last slide because the question I would like to ask is, what are the next steps? Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. So from Penang, we now move to the UK with Professor Michael Morrison.
Well, I don't know if anybody can hear me, but I can't hear anybody at the moment or see anything.
Yeah, we can't do that.
I can see the sort of introduction screen at the moment and not my slides. Oh yeah, thank you. Am I now going?
Okay, yes, we can hear you from here.
Yep, good. Okay, well, thank you very much. Very good to be here, even if virtually. I am going to give you a very sort of rapid look at the British system of protection of heritage generally and cultural landscapes. And in theory, we have an excellent system that is sort of world class. In practice, there are plenty of things about it that I don't think work very well, and I'm going to try and point those out. And I think that the similarities between the British system and the Hong Kong system, which after all, in some ways derives from it, is something that may ring some bells with you. So next slide, thank you. In practice, I'm really going to talk about the British scheme overall, but actually in reality, the English scheme. The Welsh scheme, the dragon on the green background down there, is very similar to the English scheme. The Scottish one and the Northern Irish ones are really very different. They have different legislation in place and slightly different ways of organizing things. And that in a way is the sort of first level of complexity in what is not a particularly big country in the first place. Next slide. The interesting thing I think to start with is just to talk about how our appreciation, thinking about cultural heritage has changed over certainly over the 50 years that I've been involved in thinking about heritage conservation. When I started, the protection of heritage, be it landscape or buildings, was very much about aesthetics. It was perhaps about history. And if you take a great building like this and you thought about what made it special, you'd probably talk about the architect, you'd talk about the artists who'd worked on it, the craftsman who'd worked on it, the landscape designer. And what you really wouldn't be terribly interested in is the people who actually paid for it and the reasons how they paid for it and what made the money. In this particular case, mining. those were sort of very much not part of the consideration as to why this building was special. Next slide. The thinking has changed really quite dramatically. The whole basis of thinking about heritage is we've had much more attention to intangible cultural heritage over the certainly over the last sort of 15, 20 years. And so you get a building like this, which is now a protected listed building. It's a very ordinary 1930s semi-detached house. You can find tens of thousands of these across England. Why is it special? Why is it listed? Well, it's because it's where John Lennon, who needs no introduction, was brought up. And so it's it's an exact reversal of why it's special. It's special because of the person who lived there, as opposed to the people who built it, designed it, whatever. Next slide. And if you take something like the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, which was listed very recently as a protected building, this was listed not because it's it's a rather ordinary sort of mid-Victorian public house. It wasn't listed for the quality of the building or the quality of the interiors or anything like that. It was listed because it's an enduring, it says in the list, it's an enduring, an important venue for the LGBTQ community. It's listed because of the sort of people who used it. And so the thinking about heritage in buildings terms has certainly changed dramatically. And next slide. I think the same really is true. We saw this, probably the sharp-eyed glimpse this on David's presentation, Blenheim Palace with the splendid park around it. And thinking about this in terms of landscape, if you read the listing of this, it was an early listing, listed in 1957 as a special building, as a special place. And if you read the listing, what you read about is the architects of Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor. You read about Grinning Gibbons, who carved lots of the decoration. You read about Sir James Thornhill, who did a painting internally. You read about the landscape gardener, Henry Wise, who designed the gardens, and you read about Capability Brown, who designed the landscape. What you don't really find anything about at all is the Duke of Marlborough, who was the reason why the whole place was built in the first place. So, the thinking when this was listed was about the sort of the aesthetics, the design of the whole thing. And next slide. I think if you were to have a conversation about landscape, cultural landscape today, you'd be much more likely to find yourself talking about urban landscapes, to be talking about places like Brick Lane in East London, and the whole sort of picture has shifted. People are much more concerned about the intangible, about the relationship of people and places, and attempting to make the judgments about what is special to make them more relevant to different groups of people, different ethnic groups. This particular site has been a place that various ethnic groups have moved through as they've arrived in the country, have settled there for a time and then moved on. It becomes a very special place. And next slide. And if you think about this in terms of the sort of wider landscape, not the built landscape, but the natural landscape, the preoccupations, I think, of the people who are managing this at the moment are much more to do with access for different groups of people. So the people who really they're not interested in are the ones in the bottom left-hand corner, they're middle-aged, they're middle class, and they're white, and they're people who already have access to the countryside in a big way, making it possible for different groups to use it. There's something now called Muslim hikers, which is being promoted quite a lot at the moment in the press and the media, getting different groups out into the countryside. And of course, access for everybody, for disabled groups in particular, has become something which is seen as very significant. So the top left-hand slide, I mean, I think one entirely understands the reason why, and you know, it's obviously a good thing in many ways, but it does on occasions make the country feel as though it's been sort of over manicured to the point where you begin to lose the sense of a natural place. So next slide. The issues that are really sort of dominating, I think, the landscape, and certainly the natural landscape, are to do with how it's going to be used. It's a small island. We have real pressure, the same as Hong Kong. I mean, there is a great pressure for development, and so everything is protected in many ways, but you know, it's protected, but there is pressure for green energy. There's pressure for space for housing. There's a major debate going on about the way that the landscape is used and how it's protected. So next slide. In many ways, as I say, we have what ought to be seen as an exemplar of protection systems, both for buildings and for landscape. This, I won't run through the whole thing, but this is a sort of just a snapshot of some of the key points in time where things happen to afford that protection. The thing which is interesting is that actually, though we would perhaps hold ourselves up in England, in the UK, as sort of exemplars of heritage protection, we were actually pretty slow off the mark. Many of the countries on the European continent, Germany and France in particular, had better systems in place earlier than the British did. And really, the protection starts by pressure from not from government at all, but from people like William Morris setting up SBAB, and Octavia Hill setting up the National Trust. And the pressure from them creates the first Ancient Monument Protection Act at the end of the 19th century. And it's really not until 1947 that you get sort of genuine protection for buildings, and really not until 1967 where you get conservation areas from the Civic Amenities Act, which are, I think in many ways are a key tool for protecting cultural heritage landscapes, and one which is sadly really underused at the moment. And you know, we go right through to the present day. We're currently working on still the 2012 National Planning Policy Framework, but that is likely to be changed. We've been talking about changing it for about 20 years now, and it keeps getting put off, but it is likely to be changed shortly. So next slide. Really, the 1947 Planning Act is the key in terms of protecting buildings, and as you can see, there are now getting on to 400,000 buildings protected in England. I think there's really quite an interesting question to ask about whether we're actually now getting too many buildings listed. The system continues to add buildings for protection, but it never really removes any. And you have some fairly strange anomalies. Nobody actually knows how many listed buildings there are. Some things on the right there, that little agricultural building in Dovecote, and the walls may well be listed as curtilage of part of a wider landscape and wouldn't be listed separately. And on the left-hand picture, things like that terrace of housing may well be listed as a single item as opposed to individual buildings. And this is where, as I say, I think that conservation areas would be a better bet than actually listing the terrace, which is listed at grade 2. Actually, the reality is that it's probably been completely mangled inside. It will have been altered without anybody ever getting permission. And the important thing about it is probably its external appearance and its contribution to the streetscape. And that would be better protected under conservation area legislation than under listed building legislation. So it's a system which I think could take quite a lot of alteration and looking at. Next slide. It's incredibly complicated the way that the whole thing is managed. There are 45 counties, 435 local authorities responsible for planning. If you take somewhere like London, it has 30 local authorities within the Greater London area. A city like Birmingham has 20, and the size of these planning bodies varies enormously, and therefore their funding and the skills behind them. And there are all sorts of people who have to be consulted. I mean, there are the statutory bodies who, they're voluntary bodies, but some of them very well funded, others not so well funded. And there are hundreds of local amenity societies who have to be consulted about any application. And so the complexity of the system, really makes it difficult sometimes to see how it's working properly. I mean, at one level, it's very democratic, but at another level, it's really questionable how democratic it is in terms of the way the system works. Next slide. And landscape protection follows a similar pattern to the protection of buildings. It's something that comes about through mass pressure. The first sort of element to do that would be the protection of commons, and starting with a London common, Wandsworth common, and going on from there. The Ancient Monuments Act does provide some protection for cultural heritage landscape. I mean, the first list of, the first schedule, I should say, of ancient monuments listed 43. Well, it was actually amended many times in the first few years to allow local authorities to schedule landscapes and buildings, mainly things like archaeological sites, but some buildings did get scheduled, and that's provided a real sort of complication. I have worked on a number of buildings which were both scheduled and listed, and you get sort of weird dual authorities looking at everything that happens. In many ways, the natural landscape is better protected than the built landscape, in my view. In 1949, you get the national parks, and that the national parks also run alongside the areas of outstanding natural beauty, which are a very significant protection. In terms of actually listing and protecting gardens and parks specifically, you don't get a lot of protection before 1983, when the Register of Historic Parks and Gardens was set up. And interestingly, we don't really get any World Heritage sites don't come in until 1986, though actually they've had very little impact on the way that the legislation controls things. So next slide. If you take the national parks, on the left-hand picture there, that's about 10% of the country is now in national parks. And they form their own planning authority. They are actually pretty good at protecting the natural landscape. They are much less good at protecting the sort of built cultural heritage within that landscape in terms of its what we're talking about here, cultural landscape. And if you take the slide on the right-hand side, you've got the black blobs are the national parks, and over the top of them are the other protected areas. So the dark green are the areas of outstanding natural beauty, and the little dotty lighter green are areas of special scientific interest. So, the reality is that a large amount of the country is protected by legislation that is primarily looking at the natural landscape rather than the built landscape. Next slide. If you add on to that green belts, you can see that you're beginning to get a sense of how much of the country has sort of specific legislation protecting it. So the green belts are in the darker green there, superimposed over the other protected areas, and the green belts are in many ways they are protecting cultural heritage landscapes, but they're more concerned with not doing anything than they are with perhaps encouraging things being done in an appropriate way. Next slide. So in my view, the problems with the system are that there just are far too many bodies and people involved in attempting to protect the cultural heritage environment, to protect heritage generally. There are 3 government departments who are involved, and they keep changing their names and they keep changing who's responsible for which bits. There are a whole series of levels of local government who are involved in controlling planning and building. Next slide, there are a whole series of people who are involved and are needing to be consulted and who can exert pressure over what's done. So in any significant scheme for building something or changing something in a protected area, you could expect anywhere between 1 year and up to 5 years to actually achieve the sort of permissions you need to do things. So it's potentially a very big drag on the way that things are managed, and that is a sort of serious problem for anybody trying to do things in the countryside. Next slide. The whole thing comes down really finally to the 400 odd local authorities. They are the people who control the system, and really the problems are that they are underfunded. The protection of heritage relies heavily on conservation officers within those local authorities. The local authorities, underfunded, have tended to decide that conservation officer people they can dispense with. There are about 30% of local authorities now which don't have, I've said 20 there, but I think that it's actually grown, and about 30% now don't have in-house conservation officers. And there's a real disparity in the budgets of people. I mean, as say there, my own local authority, nothing very special about it, but the planning department has a total annual budget of 1.6 million. The National Trust, by contrast, has an annual income of 681 million. Well, if you contrast the sort of resources that people can bring to put pressure on whether something should or shouldn't be done. And there is little comparison between them. And the local authorities are terrified by the expense of appeals for refusal for permission for doing things. And they also have the problem that local authorities finally are controlled by the elected councillors, the lay members of the system, who they have the ability to call in any application for planning or listed building consent and consider it in a committee which is advised by specialists but are made up of lay people. And the reality is that many members are not terribly interested in cultural heritage. They're interested in economic growth. They're interested in employment. They're interested in development. Next slide. So, the pressures on the system. I think everybody involved in the system recognizes that it has become incredibly complicated. As I say, they've been looking at amending it for about 20 years now, 22 years perhaps. The developers who want to do things have much bigger budgets than local authorities and can sort of wear the whole thing down. There is this real shortage of housing in the country, and there's a huge pressure. I think it's entirely false, but there's a pressure to say that the controls on listed buildings, on listed landscapes, is such that it inhibits development. I think this is actually, in many ways, is nonsense, but it's certainly a popular myth. And then there's the whole question of the green agenda, the pressure to do things in terms of things like wind farms and solar panels. And sadly, at the moment, the pressure to reform the system suggests that in any new set of planning regulations that come out, the protection for heritage, for cultural heritage, is going to be watered down rather than increased. I think that's a real danger, something that is being discussed by the political system at the moment. So next item, next slide. So what should we do about it? Well, I think personally that we've got to really face the reality that education is what is needed. As part of Historic England, what used to be English Heritage, we do have quite a big schools program, which I've been involved with, getting into schools, getting at young people and teaching them about their heritage, just starting with their local cultural heritage and landscape, is a terrific way for us to get them infused. I think that our hope is that by infusing people at the right age, we can actually make them realize how important their cultural heritage is. I think it would be hugely important to try and get the sort of the legislation of which you saw rattle through the slides, but there's a whole sort of mass of legislation and different bodies looking at things. If we could bring it together, if we could have a single government ministry responsible for the whole of the planning and heritage control process, that would be terrific. If we could actually make it imperative, make it perhaps legally necessary for every local authority to employ a conservation professional on their staff. I mean, some small councils would only need one. Some big ones would need a proper department. And sadly, conservation officers are really very badly paid. They're paid at about the same sort of level as a policeman, rather than as a sort of highly trained professional. Paying them appropriately would make the whole profession more attractive, make it more appealing to be doing that. And as I say, education is what I think is absolutely essential. So that's a very brief look at what's good or bad about the British system. I suspect the same sort of set of problems and maybe the same set of answers is that in Hong Kong as well. But I hope that's perhaps gives a bit of topic for conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I can't agree with you more. I mean, many of these problems are actually quite shared, in the Hong Kong heritage conservation regime as well. And so this brings us to the final speaker. So Mr. Ben Lo, who is going to bring us back to Hong Kong, and he's going to talk about cultural from the government perspective. So Ben, over to you.
Good afternoon. Firstly, thank you for the Hong Kong Icon inviting me to speak in this symposium. So it's my great pleasure to speak here. And in the following presentation, I hope I can share with you some of my thoughts in the management tools in cultural landscape, illustrated with some examples or case studies in Hong Kong. As Hong Kong develops into a densely populated urban city, its natural environment has blended in with human activities, shaping a diversity of interesting and significant cultural landscapes, which help establish the identity of Hong Kong. It's not showing them. Okay, no problem. So in this presentation, I will take you through several cultural landscapes across Hong Kong, from some rural corners in the New Territories to the cosmopolitan heart of the city, to illustrate various policies and administrative approaches adopted by the government in managing the cultural landscape. So back to the screen now. Okay, first of all, let's head to Maipo. And Dr. Ken has already mentioned about it as a successful case. So let's see how it is managed. Maipo and the Inner Deep Bay wetlands are designated as a wetland of international importance under the Ramsar Convention. It is also listed as a site of special scientific interest. The natural shallow estuarine area has extensive intertidal mudflats, reedbeds, mangroves, traditional shrimp ponds, and fish ponds. Maipo Nature Reserve provides food and habitat for a variety of species. Wintering waterbirds form a breathtaking scene as they make their annual winter migration to roost in Maipo, which is placed as Hong Kong's bird's paradise. The majority of the site is government land, but most fish ponds have been leased or licensed to operators engaged in fish farming. This is also the only place in Hong Kong where the intertidal shrimp ponds gateway, the gateway, are in operation. Other human activities include nature conservation, scientific research, nature education and ecotourism, bird watching and nature appreciation, and small-scale rural settlement. To better conserve the Ramsar site and protect the wildlife inside, the Maipole marshes and the adjacent mudflats are listed in the Wild Animals Protection Ordinance. And access to the area is restricted. Nature wardens of the Agriculture, Fishery, and Conservation Department are on high vigilance in patrolling the Ramsar site for detecting illegal activities, including entry without a permit. Experienced bird watchers, conservationists, and academic researchers who would like to enter the restricted area must apply for a special permit to enter. Any person who enters into or be within the restricted area without a permit is liable to a maximum fine of 50,000 Hong Kong dollar. In 1997, the then Agriculture and Fishery Department completed a Ramsar site study and produced the first Ramsar site strategy and management plan for this place. It provided a general framework of management zoning and an outlined management program for the long-term conservation and wise use of wetlands of the Ramsar site at Maipole and the Inner Deep Bay area. And now, let me take you all to another beautiful cultural landscape, Tai O, with unique cultural heritage and natural attributes. This place is also mentioned in the presentation by Ken and David. And this place, I have a lot of memories. When I have just become a chartered engineer, the first project I handled was a footbridge construction across the river at Tai O. Later on in my career, I was responsible for road maintenance in Lantau Island, and I paid frequent visits to Tai O for the road inspection. In my current capacity, I am overseeing the operation of the Tai O Heritage Hotel, which is revitalized from the old Tai O police station under batch 1 of the Revitalizing Historic Building Through Partnership Scheme. The historic fishing village of Tai O lies in the northwestern corner of Lantau Island. The inlets of the river provided good shelter, attracting settlement on the riverbanks. Gradually, Tai O village was formed and student houses were built, which still stand along the waterway in the Tai O Creek nowadays, giving Tai O its unique charm. Traditional industry of fisheries, salt products, and cultivations were once developed, yet have declined over the years. The population has diminished to only a few thousand now, and the local economy is now dependent on small-scale fishing and small business catering for visitors. When you visit Tai O, you may still see local drying seafoods and making shrimp plates, which many tourists like to bring home for making some good meal. There are also quite a number of historic buildings in Tai O, like the Yang Hao Temple, which is a declared monument, the Old Tai O Police Station, which I have mentioned, Tin Hao Temple, Quan Tai Temple, etc. These form a very rich heritage elements in this area. The student houses, despite being an iconic feature at Tai O, were in fact squatters not erected according to the relevant standards and regulations, and are likely less than satisfactory in various aspects, including structural, density, fire safety, ventilation, and hygiene standards. Instead of clearing these structures right away, the government adopts a more tolerant approach to regularize and control the student houses. The student houses were given the government land license in or before 1970s. The policy was to regularize unauthorized structures erected on government land in rural areas. Licensed structures are tolerated on a temporary basis if they comply with the license requirements. Besides, the planning department completed a study of revitalization of Tai O back in 2001. Stakeholders, including local people, organizations, professional institute, green groups, and tourism industry were consulted during the study. A planning strategy was then formulated to sustain the community of Tai O and the cultural heritage, natural environment, and local economy of the place, and to rejuvenate the fishing village of Tai O with its unique heritage and characteristic. The government also announced in the 2018 policy address to set up a 1 billion lantau conservation fund to promote the conservation of lantau and to pursue minor local improvement works in villages and communities in support of conservation initiatives. The fund will support projects that would contribute to the overall conservation of lantau, to raise the community awareness on the conservation of lantau, and to engage the community to put conservation in practice, with a view to fostering a quality living environment for the current generation and beyond. Part of the fund is dedicated to provide financial support to eligible non-government organizations, charities, post-secondary education institutions, etc., to collaborate with local communities and landowners and carry out conservation and related projects in lantau. Up to now, there are several approved research and education and engagement projects related to the Tai O area. Apart from human activities, the nature itself may as well pose some threats to the cultural landscapes. Tai O, located in a coastal low-lying area on Lantau Island, is susceptible to the extreme weather brought about by climate change. Back in 2008, on the 7th of June, a record-breaking rainstorm struck Lantau and caused multiple landslides on the hillside of Tai O, impacting some village houses. The multiple landslides in other parts of Lantau Island also caused collapse of around 100 meters of Kershan Road, which cut off telecommunications network, land transport, and water supplies in Tai O at that time. I personally involved in this incident when I was responsible for the road maintenance in Lantau. I visited the area that afternoon and saw that part of the road disappeared. It's terrible. And the soil, the debris, the mud washed away from the landslide, all washed down to the low-lying area of the Tai O, accumulating up to the chest level. At that time, we need to mobilize all the resources from the maintenance contractor, not only in Tai O area, but in other new territories area, to clear the mud and to rebuild the road. It took us around 2 weeks to reconstruct that road and maintain the road traffic. But for the clearance of the mud in Tai O, we take around 1 to 2 months. Also in August 2017, the typhoon signal number 10, which is the highest level of tropical cyclone warning signal in Hong Kong, was issued upon arrival of a typhoon, causing flooding and huge storm surges in Tai O. So how we cope with this situation? In preparing for the potential impacts of extreme weather conditions of more frequent and severe rainstorm due to climate change, the past landslides in Tai O have been studied, and lateral terrain hazard mitigation works have been carried out, aiming at reducing the landslide risk in the area. Rubble mound structures and concrete walls along the seashore were also constructed to protect Tai O against high waves during typhoon. Upon the Hong Kong Observatory's alert for storm surge in Tai O, the Drainage Services Department will deploy emergency response team to install demountable flood barrier at pre-identified locations as an additional layer for protecting the significant fabric at Tai O against flooding. With the inter-department collaboration and implementation of the preventive measures, the vulnerable low-lying fishing village is more well protected from the impact of extreme weather due to climate change. After some quick tours in the rural and village area, I now take you back to the city center of Hong Kong, the Central. In the early 19th century, Central was nothing more than a sparsely populated area along the lofty shore of Hong Kong Island, in front of the steep hills and facing a beautiful deep water harbor. The area was first chosen as to house the city's major military facilities and administration center. Traders and missionaries came shortly after. Today, Central is still the administrative center of Hong Kong and has become home to many international and mainland financial and business corporations. While fascinating new high-rise buildings have been constructed over time, numerous examples of original architecture remain preserved within the cityscape. Standing on the hilly terrain along the shoreline, all of these have been fused and distilled into the district central we see today. In 2009, Conserving Central was introduced in the policy address. A series of innovative projects were put together to help reinvigorate the legend of Central. These projects include the new Central Harbourfront, the Central Market, the former Police Marine quarters on Hollywood Road, which has been revitalized into PMQ, Central Police Station compound where we are here and revitalized into Tai Kwun, Central Government Offices Complex, former French Mission Building, this too has been turned into a legal hub, Murray Building, which has been turned to a hotel, and the Hong Kong Seng Kong Hui compound. The revitalization of these historic buildings and public spaces has been planned with careful thoughts of preserving the social, historical, and architectural features in Central, while adding new life and vibrancy to the area. From Conserving Central down to the place here at Tai Kwun, I would say Tai Kwun itself is also a cultural landscape. It is a place that witnessed the legal development of Hong Kong. Tai Kwun basically comprises of three parts: the police station, the magistrate, and the prison, which provided a one-stop legal service within the premises. The site is now protected by the Antiquities and Monuments Ordinance because it is a declared monument. Also, it has been revitalized by the Hong Kong Jockey Club into a new use, a center for heritage and arts, a place of inspiration, stimulation, and enjoyment for all Hong Kong people. Just now, I've talked a lot about the harborfront in Central. So why don't we take a further step down from the land to the sea and see how we protect Victoria Harbour, where all the legacy of this small fishing village begin. Situated between Hong Kong Island and the Kowloon Peninsula, Victoria Harbour is well recognized for its deep waters and strategic location. It has transformed from a traditional shelter for fishermen and merchants to a trading port and a major financial center, and has witnessed centuries of history and changes in a place that has become our city today. Nowadays, Victoria Harbour has become a major symbol of Hong Kong, our historic heritage, and arguably our most precious natural asset. It has brought and continues to bring to our economy benefits beyond measure. It adds to the character and charm of our heritage city life and is a source of pride to the people of Hong Kong. That said, Victoria Harbour itself has undergone a lot of change due to our economic activities and development. There were a series of reclamation projects spanning from the mid-19th century to the 20th century as both sides of Victoria Harbour to expand Hong Kong Island and Kowloon Peninsula. These reclaimed lands were rapidly developed into urban area. The coastal line have therefore been shifted outward, and the harbour has become narrower over the years. The government is now committed to protect and preserve the harbour from further reclamation and enhancing it for public enjoyment. To form a basis for the protection, the boundary of the harbour is defined in the interpretation and general clauses ordinance as shown in the blue area in the slide. Based on such definition of the harbour, the protection of the harbour ordinance stipulated that the harbour is to be protected and preserved as a special public asset and a natural heritage of Hong Kong people. And for that purpose, there shall be a presumption against reclamation in the harbour. The presumption against reclamation can only be rebutted by establishing an overriding public need for reclamation. The decision that there is an overriding public need for reclamation must be based on cogent and convincing materials. Through the legislation, Victoria Harbour is protected from further reclamation and remains a community asset to be enjoyed by the people of Hong Kong. For the central harbourfront area, a planning study has also been conducted. After collecting views from the public and relevant task groups, it is recognized that the urban design vision is to create a vibrant, green, and accessible waterfront in Central, emphasizing the respect for its natural context, existing urban fabric, and cultural heritage. So I'm glad having this opportunity to share with you some cultural landscapes in Hong Kong. Through these cases, I hope you can get some idea about government's tools for managing cultural landscapes, which including the legislation and enforcement, setting up of policies, conducting planning studies and formulating strategies, drawing up management plans, and implementation of preventive works. With all these measures, the government guide appropriate land use and development of the cultural landscapes to conserve their distinctive cultural elements and significance, such that they can be sustainable for the benefit and enjoyment of present and future generations. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Ben. So originally we were scheduled to have an audience choice of Hong Kong's cultural landscape, but we're running a little bit short on time. So let's move on directly to the panel discussion. So over to you, Montera.
Okay, thanks very much to Fredo. Perhaps in the interest of hearing from the audience, I could suggest that there's quite a number of people who are joining us in Zoom. Perhaps you could share the question, Fredo, and then people could type their answers old-fashioned way just in the Zoom chat, and then we can get a sense of audience concern.
Okay. Sure. So the mic. Okay, so Ken and David and Ben, please take your places over here.